We're going to talk about the different types of passwords you can set on a router, the enable passwords to get from user mode to privilege mode, console passwords for the line console 0, auxiliary port, as well as telnet passwords, password encryption, as well as password recovery. There are a few different ways people are going to go in and access your device. One is the console port here. This is the console port, and this is a physical access method. If they have physical access to the device, they can plug this cable in from their laptop to the console port on the back of the device and go in and configure the router. Now, we can put a password on the console port, so that way if somebody does plug into it, they're going to get hit with a password. Auxiliary port. Once the router is initially configured, this is typically used as a modem access method. But if the router has been configured initially and there's like an enable password or just a router name, something configured on it, people can actually plug into the auxiliary port and access the operating system as well. We don't want people plugging into that auxiliary port, so we should put a password there. And the last method that people are going to use to access your device is Telnet. Now, network connectivity must be up. There by default needs to be a password set. So that's another issue. You can't even Telnet in without putting a password. And that's another way that people are going to go in and access your device. So they can access it through the console, auxiliary port, or Telnet. So those are three different methods people can use to access your router. Each one of those methods must have a password set. If people have physical access to your device, it doesn't matter if there's a password set because they can easily bypass that. But let's go in and take a look at configuring the passwords on this device. So if somebody does gain access, they're going to have to enter a password to get into any important modes. And this is the mode they're going to want to get into. I'm in privilege mode right now in the router prompt that I've brought up. I know I'm in privilege mode because there's a pound sign here. So if I were to exit out, right now it shows me I'm connected through console 0. It's available. I hit enter and I'm automatically in user mode. Now in user mode I can't make any configuration changes to the router, but I can go in and view the configuration of the router. What I need to do is set it up to where if somebody's even going to get to user mode, they've got to enter a password. So I enter into privilege mode. Next, go into global mode with the conf space T command. And now I need to go in and enter a password at line console 0 because console is the one I'm connecting to. There's only one. It starts with the number 0. So I type in line console 0 and hit enter. Now I have to configure a password. I type password Cisco. So if anyone tries to enter this router and get to user mode, they're going to have to remember that the password is Cisco when they plug into the console 0. Now, I'd probably use a more secure password as Cisco is not too tough to figure out. However, let's take a look at that password. We'll test it. I exit all the way out. And for some reason, I'm thinking I am not going to get prompted for a password. I hit enter. I did not get prompted for a password. My hunch was right. The reason I didn't get prompted for the password is I never turned on the password prompt. You actually have to, even if you set a password, you have to tell the router to prompt the user for the password. So my work is not done. I have to type in the word login. This is the key word. This is what's going to tell the router, hey, if somebody's trying to connect into the line console, show them the password prompt. So login is an important command here. If I don't have login typed in at the line console 0, they're not going to get hit with a password prompt. So I'm done. Exit out. Now, if I hit enter, I get hit with the password prompt because of that login word. So it takes two things to get a password set. I am typing right now, but you cannot see that I'm typing right now. It's not going to show you that you're typing. All the time I get students going in and starting to type, and they'll keep typing, and they'll think the router's not responding. It's just not showing you that you're typing anything, even though you are. I hit enter. I typed it wrong. type it correctly, hit enter. Again, it doesn't show me any characters that I'm typing out, and it takes me to user mode. Now, again, user mode is what I call scrub mode. You can't do anything in it, anything worthwhile anyway. However, you can view things. To get to privilege mode, however, you just type the word enable, and once you're in privilege mode, that's where you have control of the device. And again, I know I'm in privilege mode because of the pound sign. Now I can go in and start messing some things up. So, ideally, you'd also have a password to get from user mode to privilege mode. And this password would affect anyone, whether they're telnetting in, using the auxiliary port, or using the line console to get into the router. Now, there are two different ways for me to set a password that will prompt people for that password when they're going from user mode to privilege mode. What I'll do first is I'll enter the first type of password. All I do is I type enable password. Enable matches the command that people actually use to go from user mode to privilege mode. I type enable password, and I'll use Cisco. I exit out, do a show run, and I can check the password out right here. Enable password Cisco. Now, this password, if I walk away from my router for a minute, somebody else sneaks in behind me and they do a show run, they're going to see this password and they'll be able to write that password down. Again, I shouldn't have easy access to my router. I shouldn't have my laptop wide open with a hyperterminal session going. But again, if I do, I would like this password to be encrypted. There is an additional password I can set. If I go in and I type enable secret, and this time I'll use Cisco, enable secret Cisco, that creates an encrypted password. So I'll do a show run, and I can check it out here. Here's the enable password Cisco, here's the enable secret, and then whatever the heck those characters mean. There are websites that you can go to. You can copy this, paste it into the website, and it'll tell you what the password is. However, it's a lot better than just somebody looking into your prompt and seeing Cisco right here as the password. I've set both passwords. They both do the same thing. So, since I've set both, the secret password is the one that's going to be used. Enable password Cisco is basically useless at this point. So all I have to do to get rid of that, I'll go into global mode. I always like cleaning up the configuration. It doesn't hurt for me to leave it here, but since it's useless, why leave it in? I see a lot of router configurations that are cluttered with stuff that's not even being used. If something's not being used, get rid of it. Enable password Cisco. Actually, at this point, I just go no, enable password, and it'll go ahead and get rid of it. I can do a show run, and I can verify that the only password for user mode to privilege mode is in the enable secret password. Let's take a look at setting the auxiliary password as well as the telnet passwords. So I'm plugged into the router right now through the line console. So if I exit out and I hit enter, I get prompted for a password to get in. Watch what happens when I plug into the auxiliary port. Plugged into the auxiliary port, and watch what happens when I hit enter. I get right to user mode, no password, magically. So I've got to go in and set a password on the line auxiliary 0. If I do a show run, a little help, I might have forgotten how to set the password. I see here right underneath line con 0, I've got to type in login, and I have to go password Cisco. And I would do that underneath line auxiliary 0. Line 1 through 16 here, this is a router with a lot of modem spots in the back of it, and that's what these are. Those might not always be there, probably won't be there. So line auxiliary 0 here is the one that I would go in and set a password on. All I have to do is go to global mode, type line auxiliary 0, and then these two lines right here, and I'll be set. So let's do that. Line auxiliary 0, and I can actually, if I wanted to, I could even copy and paste. If I'm extremely lazy or I'm a horrible typer, I could actually copy right out of the prompt and paste it in. That can be helpful when you're working with access lists, things like that. We'll talk about what access lists are later. So I've set a password for the auxiliary port, and so people can telnet in, line VTY space 0 space 4 is here. Now 0 is the first telnet session, 4 is the last telnet session. Notice by default login is already there, meaning if there is no password set on the line VTY04, you cannot telnet into this device. So I'm just going to type in line VTY space 0 space 4 and password Cisco. Notice I did not have to type in login because it's already there. However, can't hurt to type it in again for no reason. And I can do a show run and verify that all my passwords are here. So there's the secret password to get from user mode to privilege mode. And at the bottom here, I've got a password for line console, auxiliary, and line VTY. All my passwords are set. Problem. Somebody comes along behind me, checks this out, does a show run. All the passwords are in plain text. If I want to, I can encrypt all the passwords on the router. If I do a show run, I can see the command right here. It says no service password encryption, meaning service password encryption is turned off. If I want to turn it on, I just remove the no from the statement. So I'm in the router prompt, I go to global mode. Again, if I want to be really lazy and I hate typing, I can go copy, paste, service password encryption, and watch what happens. If I do a show run now, all my passwords are encrypted. Again, you can go online, find a website, copy, paste them into the website, and they'll decrypt the passwords for you. But it's a lot better than just somebody being able to open up your prompt and seeing all the passwords. Something else I might do to the router. Just in case, I walk away from the router and for whatever reason, I'm gone, I don't come back, and I leave this setup available. So anyone that walks into the server room or where the heck the router is, I've seen them in closets, will be able to have access to the device. So whatever method I'm using to connect to the device, I would like it to log me out. It's kind of like a screensaver with a password lock on it. Logs me out after a certain period of time of being idle. So what I can do is for each method of access, I can put a timeout. First method of access, line console 0. The command is exec -timeout. So exec -timeout, and then it goes minutes and seconds. So the time in minutes, so I go 10 minutes, and then I can specify time in seconds. Or I could hit carriage return, meaning hit enter. So exec timeout 10 space 0 means 10 minutes, 0 seconds. It's going to lock me out. Do not do this. Exec timeout space 0 space 10. Because after 10 seconds of being idle on your keyboard, it's going to go ahead and kick you out. I used to do this to my students quite a bit, set their exec timeout to like 5 seconds. It was really funny until one student got so mad he started screaming at me. So again, be careful. It can be frustrating if you set this to too low a number. I have seen people set it to 0 space 1 accidentally. And so if you're idle for a second on the keyboard, it's going to kick you out. Again, if done properly, very helpful. Exec timeout 10, meaning 10 minutes. Now I can go to line auxiliary 0. So if I'm connected in or dialed in and I'm idle for 10 minutes, I can go ahead and get kicked out. Line VTY. This way, no matter what method of access people are using, if they're idle on the keyboard for a certain period of time, it's going to kick them out. That's important. That way, somebody walks along, you might have gone to the bathroom for an extended period of time, somebody walks along behind you, they cannot go in and access the device. It'll kick them out. And this is the prompt it would kick them out to, kick them all the way back to the beginning. What do I do when I'm connected to the device? I get prompted for a password, and I don't know it. After trying a few standard passwords a couple of times, figuring out that I'm not going to get in, I've got to go ahead and initiate the password recovery procedure. Let's take a look at how we do that. But first of all, I want to make sure I save my configuration. So I will remember the password for a second here. I'm going to save everything with copy running config, startup config. Because if I have to do password recovery and nothing's been saved, everything's going to be gone. So I just saved my configuration. And what this does, running config is what's in RAM, how it's currently configured. Startup config is non-volatile RAM. So if I reboot the router, whatever's in startup config is saved. So copy running config startup config takes my current configuration and makes a copy of it and puts it in NVRAM. So that way if I reboot the router now, it'll use this configuration that's in NVRAM to configure the router. If I didn't save anything, I reboot it, it'll come up unconfigured, or whatever old configuration was in NVRAM would be used. Now let me forget my passwords again. So I hit enter, type the password, I don't know it. What am I going to do? I have to go in and reboot the router. I'll reboot the router by using the power switch. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn the router off and turn it back on. By the way, you need physical access to this device, which is important. You don't want people being able to do this from remote locations if they don't know their passwords. So physical access to this device, we can go in and reset the passwords. My computer is plugged into the console port and I've rebooted the router. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to abort the operating system from loading. And I do that while holding the control button and tapping pause break. So what I've just done is I see a greater than symbol, and in later version routers it'll actually say ROMMON for ROM monitor. And I see this greater than symbol, so I know I'm in this, basically it's a safe mode for the router. Now what I want to do is I want to change the configuration register setting. So in older routers, I type O/R 0x2142. What I've done is I'm changing the configuration register setting from 0x2102, which will use the configuration file in NVRAM when it boots, to the configuration register setting of 0x2142, which will ignore the configuration file when it boots. So I just hit enter and nothing happens, so that's good. And I can go ahead and reboot the router and it'll come up unconfigured. In a newer version router, what you would do is you would type confreg 0x2142, and that would go ahead and set the configuration register setting to something that would ignore what's in NVRAM when the router booted. You just want to be careful. You don't want to get this number wrong. It can change baud rate, it can do a lot of things, so you want to make sure you know what configuration register setting you're using, as well as make sure you type it in appropriately. If you don't, you can cause some problems. So all I have to do is go ahead and reboot the router, and the router will come up unconfigured. And I want it to come up unconfigured because in the configuration file are a bunch of passwords I have no clue as to what they are. So I've rebooted the router and it's booted up now, and it's brought me to the initial system configuration dialog. What this is, if I do enter the initial configuration dialog, this is basically a wizard, Cisco's version of a wizard, that will allow me to go in and configure the router based on a series of questions. Cannot stand this thing. It works well, but it's better if you just know what you're configuring and you go in and configure it, because if you answer some of these questions wrong, the router will not function. So what I've done is I've used the Control-C to get out of that, and I wait for it to do its thing here. Hit enter a few times, and I am in user mode. So I type in enable to get to privilege mode. At this point, I've bypassed any places where there might be a password. Usually there might be a password to get from to get into user mode, and then we have another password to get from user mode to privilege mode. I'm in privilege mode now, and I haven't had to enter a single password in. But again, the router is unconfigured. If I do show running config, nothing's set up on the router. But if I do a show startup config, what's in NVRAM, I can see the configuration. Here's my host name, there's my password set, all that stuff. So all I need to do at this point is type in copy startup config running config. And what that does is it copies the configuration file that's in NVRAM to the running configuration and configures the router accordingly. So I go copy startup config running config. The router is now configured. Notice what happens to my prompt. It goes to Palestra router 1, so it's configured exactly the way it was before I went in and did the password recovery procedure. And the nice thing about this, I'm in privilege mode now without entering any passwords. You must have physical access to do this. What good does that do me? I do a show run. I can't see what the passwords are, but I can go in and set my own. So all I would do at this point, as I would type enable secret Cisco, something I know, and I go to line console 0, password Cisco, and I just go in and reset all the passwords to something that I knew without affecting the actual configuration file. So I can have the router up and running again exactly the way it was configured before, but with new passwords. You must have physical access to the device to be able to do this. And you do want to be careful. And you got to realize if you do reboot the router and it comes up unconfigured, if anybody's trying to get access to the WAN or out to the internet or anything like that while the router's down, they're not going to have that access. So you'd effectively be killing a WAN link by doing this. So it's not something you'd want to do during normal operation hours if the router is functioning appropriately. In this video, we've talked about setting the passwords, the enable password, the console passwords for line VTY for Telnet access, auxiliary port for modems, or again, you can just plug right into that like the console port, as well as the console port passwords. Why are they important? Again, if somebody gets access to your device or access to the operating system, they can mess everything up. So you don't want unauthorized personnel accessing your operating system on the router. How to encrypt those passwords? So if you make a mistake, leave the prompt open and you don't have any timeout values, you walk away, somebody can come in and actually see the password just by typing show run. And then what we do when we don't know the passwords in the first place. I use password recovery. If you buy a router used, it's been previously configured, or somebody leaves, a disgruntled admin changes all the passwords, messes everything up so people can't get in. Whatever the case, you need to recover the passwords or bypass the passwords. Password recovery process will do that without messing up any of the other configuration.